Thank you very much. And hello, everybody virtually. And of course, those of you who are going to be panelists of today, I'm really delighted and super excited that we have finally got to have this meeting because it has been really huge work that team has led in a really busy year. And at a time where I think our goalposts on this whole biometrics topic kept on shifting and moving. We've seen a number of regulations and legislations addressing specifically biometrics, from the EU AI Act to even the DMA, DSA, but of course US laws and multiple regulatory guidance. But also it's been a year where we've heard so many concerns, right, from all stakeholders about the deployment of biometrics technology. Yet on the other hand, it was a year where also arguments were made for very strongly that there are real benefits in using technology, and of course the use cases that of course our paper talks to as well have been numerous as well. So it's one of these topics that actually gets people going, gets sort of passions running wild, and of course what we wanted to do in a always CIPL style is to have a more measured, informed, controlled conversation to look at this topic from multiple points of view. One, in particular, what are the case studies and where the technology is going and how it's going to be deployed? What are some of the key concerns and risks and harms that we do need to address? What is happening on legislative front, and how are legislators struggling, if you like, to find that fine balance between enabling beneficial use of technology and innovation, but of course mitigating and confining the risks. And of course, again, in CIPL style, we of course come up with some recommendations, in particular, the need for risk-based approach, context, use case-based regulation of biometrics technology, and very much depending on how it is used, and very much depending on the actual risk that takes place. That, of course, requires regulators, policymakers, and companies to be much more accountable, much more thoughtful when developing, deploying, and putting these technologies on the markets. Of course, we work with these kind of companies, but that's just a little grain of salt in the huge cellar of salt that is the world today. And we really want to bring this conversation globally to those who are thinking how to regulate biometrics technology, to those who are concerned about it, and of course to organizations who are building the tools and deploying these technologies in so many ways. I mean, the final point is just to say that, look, we've seen some interesting case law and case studies from the prohibition, for example, of clear view AI, biometrics, data scraping, to some really profound conversations around biometrics, real-time surveillance by law enforcement and governments, for example, in the context of Paris Olympics, right? And you could kind of see how French government also tried to find that fine balance to enable this, in particular in the year when there is a really heightened security, terrorism, and kind of the risk of general polarization as well. So with that, I first of all want to thank hugely the team, Leila Abdelaziz, who's been working tirelessly on this with our members and with so many other experts, back and forth, numerous reiteration. As I say, goalposts were changing. And Matthew, of course, for leading this. And I'm really delighted to be able to listen to this conversation as well with our panelists, and to kick off this first call to launch and present to you our paper as well. So with that, Leila, thank you very much again. Everybody, the virtual floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Brianna. I hope you can all see my screen. Can someone give me a thumbs up if you can see my screen? Yeah, okay, great. This is just a brief outline of the webinar, the conversation that we have planned for you all. We're very, very excited about our recently published report on biometric technology. So I'll start this conversation with a brief summary of the wide angles and details and cracks of the biometric technology regulation policy discussion that our report covers. And then I'll pass it to my colleague, Matthew Reisman, who will moderate a very expert panel that touches on a lot of the broad uses, applications, and context of biometric technology development and deployment that we're seeing in the commercial space. I do want to flag that this discussion is limited to the use of biometric technology in the commercial space. That is the focus of our report. There are, of course, also ongoing conversations, both in the legal and regulatory space, governing and discussing and grappling with government use of biometric technology. But our discussion today will just be limited to the use of biometric technology in the commercial space. So this is our report. You can access it on our website. It's available for the public. We will link to this report directly in the chat of this webinar. It's entitled Enabling Beneficial and Safe Uses of Biometric Technology Through Risk-Based Regulations. And we think that this paper it's a report, it can be summarized in 4 main points. First, and this is something I'm very proud of, I think this was a gap in the legal and policy discussion on this topic. And we tried to fill this gap by offering a wide range of biometric technology use cases that facilitate necessary security and safety functions, healthcare solutions, and other benefits. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But it's a very helpful resource to just kind of take a step back and see all of the different ways that biometric technologies and systems are being deployed in the commercial sector. Second, our report explores the risks and concerns associated with biometric technology development and deployment. We'll get more into that. We evaluate the challenges in the current legal and regulatory approaches on the topic, and then we recommend a 3-pronged risk-based approach for regulating biometric technology. Before I get deeper into basically the executive summary and what our report discusses, I want to highlight that we're in a stage right now where biometric technology is evolving quickly and touching more and more aspects of our lives. As a global think tank, CIPL is committed.
Leila, sorry to interrupt you, but I think I'm seeing some overlays, some other screens. I don't know if anybody else sees.
Oh,
but,
sorry. That was
sure.
not intended.
Yeah, sure.
As a global think tank, CIPL is committed to thought leadership that promotes responsible and accountable innovation in the digital sphere, often through a risk-based approach. The need for a risk-based approach could not be more evident, I think, than through the lens of understanding and studying biometric technology. When we started this report and we started our research, we didn't necessarily know that we would feel as strongly about that as we do now. Our research, our research and our discussions and all of the insights that we developed through the more than a year of writing this report have really helped us understand why a risk-based approach is not only the best for addressing risks to individual rights, but also protecting innovation that's beneficial in the digital ecosystem. So going back to the report on our executive summary, we discuss how, again, the uses of biometric technologies are growing and can deliver important societal and economic benefits. At the same time, biometric applications encompass prevalent risks and unique risks inherent to certain biometric technologies. As data and privacy professionals, many of us understand the importance of balancing in our day-to-day work. And it's important to understand the benefits of biometric technologies just as equally and just as much as we understand risks of these systems. Third, we found that laws vary in application and scope around the world. Biometric data, biometric technology, biometric systems, these are very technical concepts, and they're concepts that are also evolving quickly at a technical level. So how laws and regulations define certain words can really make an impact on whether we are efficiently, effectively understanding and mitigating risk in the use of these technologies and allowing for the benefits of the technologies as well. And finally, in our executive summary, we we say that organizations need to implement accountability and risk-based mitigations that improve protections for individuals and enable responsible use. Moving on, this is kind of just a very brief snapshot of the lay of the landscape of laws targeting biometric data and technology. It is increasingly the case that biometric data is included in comprehensive national data protection laws, as we see on the left side of the screen. Brazil, China, the European Union, United Kingdom, all include provisions targeting the use of biometric data in their comprehensive data protection laws. Now, at the United States level, this is really, people talk about a patchwork of laws when it comes to state level data protection, but really, there's a true patchwork of laws when it comes to biometric data protection. We see this at the municipal level, we see it at the state level. There are some states that have passed laws uniquely targeting the processing of biometric data. There are now increasingly also, in addition to those laws, state comprehensive privacy laws that include provisions targeting biometric data. And on the left side of the screen, you'll see just a snapshot. This is not comprehensive by any means, but it really shows how engaged regulators have become on this topic. From Australia to Japan to Singapore to the United States, regulators are playing a larger and more active role when it comes to biometric technology. They are increasing their priorities in terms of issuing guidance on biometric data, but they are also increasing the rate of their investigations and enforcement actions targeting biometric data. I'm going to briefly go over some of the use cases that we highlight in our report in the appendix. And this is really just to kind of situate this conversation. When we talk about benefits and we talk about risks, what are the contexts that these benefits and risks are arising under? What are the uses? What are the applications? What are the social benefits that biometric technologies can provide us? And really understanding this context can help policymakers and lawmakers draft future-proof laws and regulations that really target mitigating risk while allowing for the benefits of these technologies. So applications and use cases range from device security. This is an interesting place where I think the role of biometric technology really proves itself. Before, for example, biometric systems were used to unlock devices and maintain device security, very few people were using numerical or number or letter alphabet-based passwords. But the introduction of biometric systems to device security allowed an astronomical increase of people actually protecting their devices. So I think it shows the kinds of benefits, that convenience, that ease, not having to memorize a complicated password, allows a benefit that otherwise we as a society would not have been able to gain. So the same is applied when you think about enterprise security. There are a lot of biometric systems and technologies that are used to facilitate safe banking and financial services. Biometric technologies are emerging in the marketing and customer experience realm, as well as health and fitness and virtual immersive experiences. Online safety is increasingly relying on biometric systems and technologies. Transportation and logistics, there are approved benefits in this area. Automotive safety, reviewing for fatigue or checking for whether animals or other living objects are around a car, sensors that can kind of track for these risks. Airport and border security, we've seen massive, the facilitation of convenience and ease in traveling in airports and through borders. Public security, for example, in stadiums and other large venues, there are some benefits that can be understood in this space, and then of course in law enforcement. Our paper also has, this is just a brief summary of the risks that we discuss in our paper, but we really dive into at a contextual level when can these risks arise, and what kinds of biometric systems and technologies can these risks arise? And we also discuss potential mitigations for some of these risks. And then finally, our report highlights key recommendations for lawmakers, policymakers, and regulators. Again, we are seeing more and more regulators taking action in ways that touch biometric technology, and not just data protection regulators. You know, in some places, financial regulators have issued guidance that directly impacts the use of biometric technologies. We're seeing more and more AI proposals, legal and regulatory proposals that target the development and deployment of AI systems, which are very intertwined with biometric technologies. So it's not just data protection. This conversation really needs to reach a wide range of regulators and policymakers. We recommend adopting a three-pronged approach for the regulation of biometric systems. And I think this really helps situate what the recommendations that I'm going to highlight after this. But what we mean by a three-pronged approach is that the laws themselves should be risk-based. The mitigations and the organizational accountability and the organizational assessments within an entity developing and deploying biometric technologies should be risk-based. And then the approach of regulators who are investigating and enforcing should be risk-based. And with that in mind, these are kind of our detailed, more targeted recommendations. We, of course, encourage regulators to regulate the use of biometric systems based on risk. And what that means is considering the purposes, the uses, the application, the capabilities, how a technology is developed, how it is processing data. It's not necessarily just whether a system is processing a certain kind of data. What really needs to be looked at and understood to properly mitigate risk and allocate resources is how that data is being processed. Second, we and our panel will definitely get into this, but what we found at a global level is deep inconsistencies across jurisdictions about how biometric data is defined. In some places, it's very limited to certain kinds of biometric data. In other places, it's so broad that it may encompass data that in a reasonable mind, it would not be biometric data. And some laws don't define biometric data at all and actually look to regulators to define biometric data. So there's a lot of variance here, and this can really kind of bring challenges to interoperability and creating consistency in terms of complying with legal obligations. So we encourage policymakers and lawmakers to strive for consistency across jurisdictions and industry when defining biometric data and systems. And we really kind of call out the fact that industry standards organizations are taking an increasingly larger role and convening multiple jurisdictions from around the world to create consensus on the technical definitions of words related to biometric systems. We also encourage lawmakers to require accountability measures to promote responsible use. This is really our wheelhouse here at CIPL. How can organizations build organization-wide accountability programs to really facilitate responsible use of data? And then finally, implement collaborative regulatory tools. So this can kind of look like sandboxes and other innovative ways that regulators are working with organizations to foster innovation, to foster the beneficial uses of technology, especially at the cutting edge, while also mitigating any risks that can impact individuals and society. So with that, I am going to, that's the summary of our report. We encourage you all to look at it. I'll link to it if it hasn't been linked to before. But with that, I will pass it to my colleague, Matthew Reisman, who will moderate a discussion on our report.
Leila, thank you so much for doing such a great job summarizing our report. For those I haven't met, I'm Matthew Reisman. I'm a Director of Privacy and Data Policy in CIPL's Washington, D.C. office. And I actually wanted to take just a moment because looking at our roster, we have many old friends, but also, given that this is a public webinar, some folks who may be new to CIPL. CIPL is a privacy, and data policy, think in do tank, as we like to say, with offices in Brussels, Washington, and London. And if you are interested in learning more about CIPL and learning about membership, please don't hesitate to reach out afterward. We'd love to chat. With that, we have an amazing group of experts with us that we're deeply grateful to have to go deeper on these themes. I'd like to begin by asking each of our panelists to introduce yourself and tell us where you're based, who you work with, but also how your organization intersects with biometric technologies, how you develop or deploy them. And just going on order, I see you on my screen. I'm going to start with Neil. Over to you, Neil. Thank you.
Hi, Matthew. So I'm Neil Costigan. I'm Chief Architect at LexisNexis Risk Solutions in the BehavioSec group. And BehavioSec was an acquisition LexisNexis did a number of years ago, a leader in the field of behavioral biometrics. So I guess we'll get into it as we go through the report, but behavioral is a subset, a relatively new subset of biometrics that we've been delivering mainly to the sector that of banking and finance is kind of the main uptake of Lexis BehavioSec customers.
Fantastic. Thank you, Neil. Janick, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Matthew. Thank you also for the invitation on the front of the panel. So yeah, my name is Janick Van Daele. I'm a privacy counsel at Mastercard. I'm based in Brussels, Belgium. I'm specifically working on fraud solutions and also dealing with everything biometrics related within the organization. And yeah, in terms of biometrics, Mastercard recently introduced a service called Biometric Authentication Service. And this is basically a multi-factor authentication that doesn't require passwords because it leverages on-device biometrics using the FIDO standard. And very briefly, how it works is that FIDO relies on standard public key cryptography. So when a user registers, their device generates a unique cryptographic key pair, and then that is tied to the web service domain. And this private key stays on the device while the public key is registered with the service. So these unique passkeys are able to replace traditional passwords and are therefore able to ensure high security without having to share secrets. And each passkey is then exclusively linked to its specific service domain. So this prevents tracking across different services, and users can then access these unique passkeys through their on-device biometrics like Face ID. And that's basically it for BAS, and we currently support multiple use cases like account protection and also payment authentication.
You know you're having a great webinar when you get fascinating use cases in the introduction section. So thank you so much, Janick. Last but not least, David, over to you.
Thank you so much to the entire CIPL team for having me, and I really have to commend you all on producing an insightful and impactful report. For those of you who don't know me already, my name is David Lehr. I am a privacy policy manager here at Meta, based in DC, and I do some of our thinking around how laws and regulations should approach different data privacy related issues, including this one of biometrics or data about the body. And when it comes to data about the body at Meta, Layla alluded to this earlier, but we see great potential for many uses of data about the body to drive new immersive experiences, new ways of interacting with individuals in new ways. I won't go through all of them right now, but just to give you a few examples, our MetaQuest Pro headset can analyze images of your eyes to estimate where you might be looking in virtual reality, as well as images of your face to estimate your facial movements. Features like these can help do things like improve the image quality of an area in virtual reality that you might be looking at, or animate your avatars to enhance the sense of presence and make it feel more like you are actually there in a virtual environment interacting with others. Our MetaQuest headsets can also analyze images of your hand to help you interact with elements in augmented or virtual reality environments. And this can also help to reduce the need for physical controllers and improve accessibility. And I'll just quickly note that I have been very intentional here in using the term data about the body instead of biometric technologies. I know we'll get into a fuller discussion of terminology later that I'm really looking forward to, but I think it'll be really important for us to keep in mind the different risk profiles of different kinds of uses of data about the body and use terms accordingly. So looking forward to that discussion.
David, thank you. And rigor around terminology is certainly a high value and something CIPL cares a lot about. So that's music to our ears, and just amazing the range of cases just we're hearing about, from fraud detection to these amazing consumer and business applications that Neil and David have told us. So excited to start digging deeper. David, I'm actually going to stay with you to kick us off on round two, and then I'll go around to all of our panelists. Let's go back to the report that Leila summarized for us. Would love to hear some of your reflections and thoughts. And first, let me take a moment to thank each of you for your organization's contributions and insights to the report, and other CIPL members and experts whom we consulted during the research process. But would love your thoughts and reflections. Were there key themes that stood out to you, David? And how do they relate to your own insights and experiences from developing and deploying data about the body or biometric technologies?
Yes, there are so many things I could comment on in the report, so it's difficult to choose. If I had to focus in on two, I think one would be the prong one recommendation that laws take a fundamentally risk-based approach, in particular by targeting the most onerous or the highest obligations to uses of data about the body to identify individuals. As Leila alluded to earlier, I think there are many different ways that data about the body can be used, and those different uses carry very different risk profiles. I think there are many uses of data about the body that don't aim to identify individuals, that pose relatively few privacy risks, provide significant benefits to consumers, and often are fully expected by consumers who seek out a particular product or service. Just to give a couple of examples, cameras for years have had face detection technology that can assess whether a face might be present in frame, or whether that face is smiling to help take a picture at exactly the right time. Or we're increasingly seeing in cars safety features that might analyze drivers' body movements or eye positions to determine whether they might be fatigued or not paying attention to the road. So I think those are the kinds of beneficial low-risk uses of data about the body that we want to make sure laws and regulations really enable. On the other hand, when considering uses of data about the body to identify individuals, I think those uses can, but do not necessarily always pose heightened privacy risks, particularly when you are talking about identification in terms of one-to-many matching instead of one-to-one matching. I think when you're using data to identify individuals, you are connecting some immutable characteristic about them to their real-world identity, and it's that connection to real-world identity that can then lead to downstream risks like pervasive tracking and surveillance in the real world. And although CIPL's report is not intended to cover government uses of these technologies, those kinds of uses, when done by governments, can pose serious risks of infringing on fundamental human rights. So I think all of this to say that if laws and regulations, data privacy ones in particular, are going to take a risk-based approach, CIPL's recommendation that they do so by targeting uses of data about the body to identify individuals is really important. And the last thing I'll say, the other aspect of the report that I'll comment on, is this issue of terminology. I think the report is absolutely right to highlight that this is a very, very fractured space when it comes to the terms that are used. Laws and regulations use many different kinds of terms: biometric data, biometric information, biometrics, biometric technology, sometimes in counterintuitive or contradictory ways. And they also vary in terms of how they apply obligations to those differently defined terms. So I think striving for consistency in public discussions around this topic and in laws and regulations will be really important. And that's why, to get to what I said earlier, I think if I had a preference here, I would encourage us to use terms based on the word biometric to refer to uses of data about the body to identify individuals, to really hit home that risk-based approach.
David, thank you so much. And thank you for elucidating further some key themes from the report. That was really helpful. Neil, I'd love to turn to you next. How did David's points resonate with you, or did you have other ones that you would flag in terms of thoughts and reflections?
No. I'd absolutely agree with David's concern about the use of terms, common terms. The area of work we're in, behavioral biometrics, is relatively unique and quite misunderstood, I believe, by people legislating and looking at policy in around biometric deployments. It doesn't do that physical match one-to-one, and yet we have that term biometrics associated with behavior. But just on my initial thoughts on the report, I mean, I've been working in around biometrics since about 1998, and it struck me when I got into the report how comprehensive this is. How much has happened, how much detail is there. There really wasn't anything in around the idea of ethics and the idea of concern around data storage, but the level of detail is there. And I think one thing that struck me, and I think it was signaled by the UK ICO report, where they said, this is these use cases, these best practices are absolutely still emerging. There's nothing finished yet. And so one would need to be on top of this continuously. The idea that you can kind of read this report or read the various laws and have, I'm the expert now and move on, just isn't going to happen. You're going to be constantly monitoring and watching these evolving best practices and standards.
Really appreciate you flagging ethics, well noted. And on the continuing to monitor, there were laws that advanced to passage by state legislatures, numerous ones, even as we were writing the report. So it never ends, as they say. Absolutely. Janick, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Everything that Neil and David mentioned really resonated with me, which might not be really surprised, but specifically the risk element, or rather that the recommendation to policymakers and regulators that regulations of biometric technology should be based on risk specifically resonated, because we've already seen this approach also in the EU AI Act, for example. And indeed, as Neil mentioned, biometric technologies are constantly improving, becoming more prevalent, use cases, best practices still emerging. And I think we've already covered that biometric applications span a wide variety of sectors, contexts. So really a standardized approach would make it difficult to implement. I think, as the report rightfully states, there's a risk that a one-size-fits-all would lead to over-regulation. But there's also the risk of under-regulation, where you could infringe on individual privacy and other rights. So rather than focusing on specific industries and use cases, the priority should really be to come to a common understanding of concepts and principles governing biometric technology, and obviously ideally at the global level, because as we've seen in the past year and years, we've had the patchwork of laws, specifically also in the US, for example, where I think David already mentioned it, we have these specific notions of biometric data which are not aligned. So I think that would be a good starting point, really, to have a good alignment on definitions. So this minimum, but I think or essential common understanding would really help unlock the socioeconomic potential of this technology and really facilitate a responsible development at a global level. And yes, this technology has its own set of risks, but we've also seen that privacy enhancing techniques to mitigate those risks are also improving. So we have, for example, cancelable biometrics, biometric template protection, or the trusted execution environments. So I believe that if we really go for that risk-based approach, it opens up the debate between the industry and regulators, which is really needed. And I think, this approach would really help support innovation, but simultaneously also protect the end users.
Thank you so much, Janick. And you alluded to another favorite CIPL theme, which is privacy enhancing technology. Would commend a recent report we did on that, but really appreciated you pointing out the linkage there. You've all alluded to a theme that we'd like to turn to next, but let's go deeper on it, which is, on the one hand, you've helped us learn more about biometric applications and increase our knowledge of it. On the other hand, we know that in the world right now, there are lots of misperceptions as well about biometric technologies, and would love for you to maybe pick some of these to go deeper on. In the report, we try to talk about this because we believe that understanding really what's going on and what isn't going on with biometrics is important for making good public policy. So Neil, let me start with you this time. Are there any misperceptions that you would point out that you'd want to clear up for folks attending?
Again, the line between physical biometrics and non-physical, and I'm specifically relating to behavioral here when I speak. But I mean, the high level, the concerns are that the capture of a biometric data, personal data, and the misuse of it for profiling people for purposes it wasn't intended to. So now when you do it or sometime in the future, I think that's the kind of overriding fear that's there. And if you think of, using the biometric to determine somebody's age or sex or ethnic background, and, these kind of things that people have a concern that a biometric can do. Well, if you get into a behavioral biometric, which is, a typing rhythm, the rhythm of typing or the depth of touch as you swipe across the screen, it's just not possible to infer any of these PII type of things. You're not able to determine somebody's age or sex or race on a behavioral biometric. But time and time again, over the last 15 years, we've been battling that discussion because, there just isn't that awareness. So the misconception that the behavioral biometric has such, on one hand, we're being questions about its accuracy and people are a little bit skeptical and we prove it, but then they're also overreaching, believing what it can do things that it just can't. So that's really the misconception of biometrics that's frustrated me. The other one is actually, I still can't believe people think gait is a valuable biometric and has any use in a commercial world. To me, it's very much an academic thing, but over and over again, I've been asked about gait for years and years. And I, it's a personal opinion, but I don't believe it should be in the realm of biometrics at all.
So I'm gonna say two things in response and maybe a follow-up question before going to our next panelist. Number one, I think you talked about this ability to link to categories of human categories, noting for our listeners, probably those on the call know already, but that's a key element in the EU AI Act, right? Where there's a certain ability to do categorization contributes to being categorized as a high risk level, or I believe prohibited use under the EU AI Act. I wanted to go back to gait. Maybe you can clear up my misperception. I had been under some impression that could be useful for things like automobiles, trying to recognize if there's a human passing through the field of vision. Is that not correct?
Human passing through is one thing, but biometric is an identifier. It just doesn't have the level of fidelity or entropy that's useful. No, I mean, you'll see a lot of academic studies, and it's an easy one for people to think, but if you actually try and implement it into kind of any level of usable in a cost versus benefits, it's just not there. Controversial, maybe, but that's an opinion I have.
We like to keep it a little controversial on our webinars, keep everybody awake. Janick, over to you. Were there any misperceptions or things people don't understand about biometrics that you'd love to clear up?
Yeah, this is actually a bit of a legal pet peeve of mine, but this comes back to the terminology that we use in the legal and the privacy community also in relation to biometrics. So you have these terms that are used in the biometric industry and the privacy community that on the surface level have the same meaning, but actually means something different. So for example, to make it very concrete, identification in the biometric industry means that, well, it has a very specific and narrow meaning. It refers to the process of comparing a biometric sample with a previously stored template that exists across a database. So this is the one-to-many matching, right? So identity in a biometric context does not require establishing a civil or legal identity of an individual, rather just seeing if there's a match between the sample and the template. And then biometric identification is established then when you have a match between that characteristic and the template. In the privacy community, you have a different term for, or a different definition of identification, and you also see that coming up in the definition under the GDPR that refers to this concept of unique identification. In the data protection context, it has the meaning of singling out. So obviously this is a broader meaning than biometric identification, which again means establishing someone's identity through that matching. So I think it's quite unfortunate that you see that GDPR definition being copy-pasted in a lot of laws. You see that also happening in the US, for example, because it's not as precise and rigorous as it should be. It doesn't take into account the precise terminology used in biometric recognition. And I just think in general that it doesn't really reflect the technological practices of the biometric technology. So I think it's really important that we hammer on this as an industry to get this terminology correct when discussing this technology with regulators, because otherwise we will not be able to have a fruitful debate.
So your comments remind me of the old saying about the English and the Americans as two communities separated by the same language or divided by the same language. I feel that about industry and public policy folks. Sometimes they may think they're talking about the same thing, but in fact they're not. And that's super important. And David, in conversations with you, I feel like this might be a theme that resonates with you as well. Let me pass it to you.
Yeah, certainly. I think it is a theme. And if we're thinking about misperceptions, to go back to your question, one misperception in the public policy space, or maybe you might characterize it more as a missed opportunity in the public policy space, I think is this desire to regulate by data type instead of by data use. We generally see across many laws and regulations an attempt to regulate by defining a term like biometric data, a type of data, and imposing requirements such as the need to obtain consent on that category, that type of data. But we've discussed how many different uses of data about the body carry different risks. And so if you really want to target those unique risks that arise in unique circumstances, I think we should maybe start to think about shifting away from regulating by data type towards regulating more data uses, those particularly risky data uses. And I think this is a theme that holds true not just in the conversations that we're having today, but in broader conversations around potentially other forms of sensitive data. This is something that scholars like Dan Solov in his recent paper have pointed out, that if we are increasingly concerned with supposedly increasing numbers of ways in which different kinds of data could be used to do potentially sensitive things, then very quickly all data becomes sensitive and there's no coherent way to regulate in a world like that. So I think if we can find a way to move regulation, move public policy more towards regulating uses, that would be very valuable. The last thing I'll say is I think doing so could also help to address in a better way some of the risks that may emerge, even when data about the body is not used to identify individuals, which we've spent a lot of time discussing. Many folks have alluded to the EU AI Act, yourself, Matthew, just a minute ago. And I think you see there one example, not the only one, but one example of how regulations might be targeted to specific risky, potentially risky uses of data about the body beyond identification. They address, for instance, emotion recognition systems, as they call it. And there's a high risk label for all emotion recognition systems and a prohibition on emotion recognition systems used in workplaces and educational institutions. So I think that's one good example of a recognition that not only are certain uses of data about the body potentially risky, but that even within those uses, there might be different contexts or different methods of implementation that themselves carry different risk profiles. So to sum up, if we could move more in the direction of regulating by data use and not be stuck with this misperception that we need to regulate by data type, I think that would be really valuable.
So David, you're sharing themes that CIPL folks get really excited about. I wrote as you were speaking in all caps with stars, context is key, and underlined it twice. Started doing a little dance, but I got a little side note from our president, Bojana Bellamy, who I also know cares deeply about these themes. Bojana, I'm going to give you a chance to speak. Thanks.
Okay, no, but I actually tried to find that reaction by my hand where I was clapping, but I couldn't do it. I don't know what's happening, but anyway, I can't. But I really want to just interject here because this is really excellent conversation, and I couldn't agree more with all of you and David and Janick in particular. The discussion on kind of the legal construct around biometrics or data about the body. I mean, the problem really we have got is that in majority of the world, this data is considered to be sensitive category of personal data by default, always, irrespective of how it's used. And I mean, if you look at GDPR, GDPR prohibits use of sensitive data unless you've got one of legal grounds. And these legal grounds are incredibly narrow, right? There's no legitimate interest. There's in fact only consent that would apply for so much biometrics. And so if we do not, so we will end up in a place where every use of data about the body, irrespective of what it is used for, how it is used for, does it identify people or not, one-to-many, we will have to have consent. And I mean, that's just going to even more make this world of data protection unattainable because people are fatigued with consents we have got today, but tomorrow, when it's going to be pervasive technology, as we have heard, it's going to be used so much more. We're all now opening our iPhones with facial recognition and laptops as well. So that's the point is that it's unsustainable. But that's all because we have categorized this as a sensitive data category, and there is no flexibility. So I do believe, and I really strongly believe, if we were to write laws again, we would probably need to move away from sensitive data category and categorize really sensitive uses of data, because otherwise it's just going to be impossible. So this is so important to understand. Now we are not in that place, right? And so we have to kind of then therefore use different tools, either through risk-based approach, calibrate that compliance, or simply say, well, in this case, we are using data about the body, but we are not identifying people. And that's going to be in many cases where there's this simply authentication, or even some of the Oculus or whatever they're called, the Quest and various virtual reality things, or in the cars, if car is realizing that I'm sleeping, nobody cares that it's me, but they need to wake this person who is driving the car because I'm falling asleep. So I really feel passionately, and this comes across in our paper. I hope people will read this because it really is these are really important legal points to make, right? That it simply doesn't work at the moment. So we need to think of something better. And those who haven't got these laws have to think of something better as well. Okay, I'll go mute now again.
No, we're delighted you jumped in, Bojana. Thank you very much. A surprise for our panelists. I'm actually going to go out of order of the questions I shared with you in advance to kind of try and build on some of where we've gone with the discussion. So you led us off with some really interesting case studies, which was fantastic, and use cases. I'm wondering if we could talk about another sort of core theme that's really important to CIPL, which is organizational accountability and how you put in place accountable practices throughout your organization to ensure that, I think, Neil, you mentioned this question of ethics. How do you build ethics and ethical practices into the core of your operations and ensure that you have full engagement and representation in your program, in your organization. So Neil, I'll start with you. Yeah.
You know, the biometric and development of biometric, deployment of biometric technology it's not unique in this regard, I believe. You know, this is best practices at the best of time for promoting kind of accountable practices. And it's, you know, it's leadership, it's transparency, it's performance metrics, it's training, it's education, but real clear policies and guidelines that, you know, and really work that at the beginning to get an understanding for people to really understand the importance of the data they're working with. And that's that we find, particularly as we, you know, in our case, as we're making this type of technology, as we onboard people who have kind of generic engineering IT skills, they really need that education to understand the nuances of the guidelines and guardrails one needs to apply to this technology. But it's you know, it's classic stuff. It's accountability. It's articulating a clear vision, and sticking to those guidelines and kind of have the metrics in a kind of whatever iterative way where people are constantly seeing that things are there and that they're important. It's not a one stop. I got certified, now I can do what I want, but we're constantly educating the team and reviewing how they perform and how they interact and understand these things. And I think that might be, you know, maybe my point of view is very much about as a practitioner of somebody who makes biometric technology might be slightly different than people who are deploying it. But I do think that that transparency and full kind of buy-in from all people is very, very important.
Actually, Neil, I'd say, for maybe speaking personally for our audience, it's super important to have your perspectives. I think often it's us public policy folks talking to each other. It's wonderful to have the voice of those building in the room, who are building the tech to help inform that.
So I think one difference, and again, just speaking from experience elsewhere in making security products and technology, it really needs to go in with data security and privacy in version 1. This can't be, hey, let's build our application, let's build our thing. And, you know, in version 2, we'll get to things like security and controls and that. If you're going to get this right, you really need to bake in right from the beginning the design. And that's tends to have more successful outcomes if data and security are a design goal right from the beginning. And often that's not the case.
Very well said. Privacy by design, certainly something we see as vital. For those watching current events in the United States today, you will have seen that the draft privacy law that has been proposed added a privacy by design section. This is a theme that's, I think, on a lot of folks' minds these days. I'm actually going to go next to David. And before I do so, I just want to point out, also to build on Neil, you're talking about a holistic process. For those who, if you haven't yet seen the report, or if you have, to remind you, we have a picture, it looks like page 27 of CIPL's accountability framework, where we try and present our vision of a holistic accountability process. We present it like a wheel with different stages of building an accountable program, and we've done a number of reports on that theme that I'd commend to you. But over to you, David.
Yeah, thank you. I think CIPL is absolutely right to note that just as laws and regulations should take a risk-based approach, so too should organizations, and that accountability and robust internal controls must be part of the process of developing these technologies. And I completely agree with what Neil said, that this really needs to be a baked in from the start kind of process. And to go back to what I mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, the Meta Quest devices and how those use data about the body, I'd emphasize that in our Reality Labs division, our product development is guided by what we call our 4 responsible innovation principles. Put people first, provide controls that matter, never surprise people, and consider everyone. And so following these principles, we have employed a suite of privacy solutions that affect how data about the body is stored and processed in privacy protective ways. To give you just a few examples, I mentioned how MetaQuest Pro can analyze images of your eyes and your face, but those features are off by default, and they have to be affirmatively turned on. In addition to some kinds of data processing being off by default, some data processing also occurs only on device. The raw images of your eyes, your face, your hands that I've mentioned, those raw images are processed only on device and deleted once processing is complete. So those responsible innovation principles are a core part of our accountability process. I'd also mention our comprehensive privacy program that we have developed over the last several years. This is a set of teams and technologies that have as their goal embedding privacy from the beginning in our product design. A core part of this is our privacy review process. It's our internal decision-making process where we make decisions over how data is used in all new products and features. And across our privacy program, we have, by the end of 2023, invested over $5 billion in it. So this is really a core tenet for us in developing these technologies.
David, thanks for giving us a view into what's going on at Meta. Janick, I'd like to turn to you. I will say, having worked closely with folks at Mastercard, you all are really doing remarkable things with building both privacy and AI programs that really foster deep accountability. Wondered if you wanted to share any additional thoughts.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Matthew. So yeah, at Mastercard, indeed, we've been working for years to create a governance structure to ensure that we're able to address AI risks and take a human-centric approach to AI. What this means in concrete terms is that we ensure that our design, development, and use of AI, which also includes biometric technology, is in line with our commitments to what we call the data responsibility principles. So they include privacy and security, transparency, accountability, and fairness, which largely align obviously with fair information practices. And these are company-wide commitments. So like you mentioned, we have a robust AI governance framework in place, which complements our privacy by design process. And this ensures that at every stage of product development, we have put in place the necessary safeguards for responsible and trustworthy AI. And I think getting this right really requires a multidisciplinary approach. So you cannot just leave this to engineers and technologists. We need them, but we also need policy experts, the product owners, and even social science experts in the room when discussing these types of topics. And lastly, at Mastercard, we've also established a few years ago an AI governance council with executive representatives across the company that oversee the use of AI and make sure that it aligns with our governance framework. So when we have, for example, novel and sensitive use cases, this council will then seek advice from independent experts and also from consumer panels. And yeah, hearing other perspectives is really key to ensure that we're able to spot possible blind spots. But of course, this is a journey, and we're constantly enhancing this in light of new developments, both technological and on the regulatory front.
Super. Thank you so much for sharing some more color on what Mastercard is doing. And I think there's a lot of practical tips for folks to kind of glean from the examples you've given. Speaking of practical, where I'd really like to kind of take the sort of in this concluding portion of our conversation is really practical takeaways for folks who've taken time to attend today. And I'm kind of going to come at this from a little different perspectives depending on each of your roles. And starting with you, Neil, as somebody who's really developing biometric technologies, do you see a particular role for those who are developing biometric technologies to support how they can support organizations seeking to deploy these in a responsible and accountable way? What do I mean? And you can tell me if this analogy falls flat. And for example, in the AI space, sometimes we see builders of models using things like system cards or model cards that kind of tell what the capabilities and limitations of systems are. I don't know if there's something similar in the biometric space or if there should be, or is there something else that, how can the developers play a role in sort of responsible downstream use of their technology?
Good question, actually, and I actually, Janick alluded to that, the AI Council at Mastercard. I think as the engineers, as we make these things, instead of being black boxes, which they very often are, I think it's quite important that we help people understand how these things work inside. And so model governance, documentation, materials to show, inside the engine of the biometric matching and usage or whatever tends to be machine learning, advanced statistics maybe, but essentially machine learning. And the proof needs to be there in public to help people on board this stuff, is to understand the models and the governance is there to prove there's no biases and that there's fairness in there. And I think that's one of the obstacles when people go to deploy, they're questioned about these things, and us as developers of the technology need to help them and aid them by providing that. And to date, I haven't seen public kind of access to those kind of things they're available, and they're usually available, in the later stages of deployment or engagement, and it's only generally if asked for. But I do think up front it would be an awful lot better for us to prove that there's no biases and there's fairness inside the things, and also the industry to standing on those common terminologies to move one step further into to accuracy and reliability. How you compare what tend to be apples and oranges, but some help in people. I think maybe your scorecard, the analogy is quite there, but right now it's very, very hard to properly compare the various vendors of even the same parts of technology. But then if you move from one type of biometric to another, quite often it's quite different. And the example again back to behavioral, there's an element of continuous authentication, this idea that we can transparently in the background constantly measure and monitor. That's quite hard to understand and quite hard to compare and contrast against other technical systems. And I think it's pretty important that we provide the material and education to people doing evaluations and deployments.
Super interesting. And I would maybe, David, I'll come to you first. Or Janick, if you have an immediate first reactions to what Neil said and his ideas that he laid out. I also want to lay for each of you the question of any broader practical tips you'd have for both teams that are thinking of developing further biometric technologies or using data about the body or deploying them. So yeah, let either of you who'd like to jump in first. David, you're leaning in literally, so I'll let you have it.
Perfect. Thank you. I think this is related to parts of what Neil was saying. I think communicating not just what risks might arise, but also what benefits can arise clearly to consumers or end users is a really important practical tip that I would give. I think it can help not only users understand better how the technology is working, but I think that building that kind of broad public understanding of these technologies will help advance the policy, the regulatory debates as well. We often, I think, see misperceptions about how these technologies work, what benefits they do or don't offer, being the impetus for some of these regulations that maybe don't regulate in the best way, or this regulatory fragmentation that Bojana mentioned earlier. So I think building public knowledge of this space and the benefits that come from many of these technologies would be very helpful.
You're helping do that today. Thank you. That's it. We agree fully. Janick, anything to add?
Yeah, definitely. I think I might want to close with 3 practical tips for privacy professionals in the audience that are currently tuned in. And some of these are probably going to be self-explanatory. But first, I think it's really important to be embedded as a privacy council into the business to really understand what they're trying to achieve, the bigger vision, what are the key priorities, and make sure that everyone on your team has a good understanding of the type of biometric technology that's being leveraged and what the concrete use case is. So you want to really understand what your biometric technology can and cannot do. So really take the time to engage with the engineers and the product team, ask as many questions as you need to feel comfortable. I think this will really ensure that your team has a common understanding and again, that common vocabulary to make the necessary assessments to mitigate vulnerabilities and also risks. But I think this will also help your AI governance leaders or leadership to get organized and really understand the needs and prioritize their efforts. And then second is, I think it's key to have a clear process for reviewing all new use cases of developing or deploying biometric technology. And there should be an escalation process in place for certain use cases or activities that can be considered as medium or high risk. And then third, what matters then is that you're able to link this back to your governance process and to the values of the company. So what are the values of your company in regards to AI? What are your data responsibility principles? And I think tying this back all together is really essential to instill a culture of responsible development of biometric technologies across the company. This also counts for AI, so that really everyone is driving in the same direction.
I can't think of a better place to close than grounding in principles, building a culture of responsible development, music to our ears. For those who, I'm checking the chat one final time for questions because we do welcome them, but not seeing any. I do want to point folks again, there is a link at the top to our report. And if you have feedback on it, please reach out to CIPL. And if you want to learn more about us, please reach out over LinkedIn or however else. But let me take a moment now just to thank our panelists for the tremendous insights you shared and for the discussion today. I learned a lot from each of you. And Leila, thanks again for the tremendous overview and your leadership of the report. With that, I think we'll close for today and look forward to continuing the discussion offline and wherever else we may meet. Thanks so much, everyone.